Well, thank you very much, Sheldon. Thanks to NBR for inviting me. Okay, I've got 10 minutes and a lot of material to present, so fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to talk today about military activities in Asian EEZs. Is there conflict ahead? I'm going to talk about what the problem is, why it's a problem, the disagreements on the issues, the options for resolving the issues, and the implications of the do-nothing, the always popular do-nothing alternative. Okay, we all know that countries throughout Asia, throughout the world for that matter, have extended their jurisdiction out to 200 nautical miles over resources. That is, they have sovereignty over the resources within these zones, but not over the activities that take place within them. The EEZ was a new regime created by the Law of the Sea Convention, did not exist before it, and has a peculiarity all its own. This is Northeast Asia, this is Southeast Asia, the entire marginal seas are taken up by these claims. And in fact, in many places they overlap. And this overlap, that's a topic for another time, but it suffice it to say it creates sensitivity within the nations themselves as to where their boundaries, the boundaries of their resource sovereignty, extend. All right, there's been a series of serious incidents. Whoops. First, and this started, perhaps, well, I'm sure it started before this, but the last series, we started with the EP3. You all know, April 1st, 2001, a U.S. Navy surveillance plane collided with a Chinese jet. The jet plunged into the sea with the loss of the pilot. The EP-3 made an emergency landing on Hainan. We'll go into the wheres and what fors in a moment. This took place about 75 miles southeast of Hainan. The Bowditch, this is a Pathfinder-class oceanographic survey ship of the U.S. Navy. It's been, in polite terms, asked to leave Chinese waters several times, both in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Also, India has asked it to leave as well. In other words, it's been run out, basically. The Impeccable incident of last year. This is the Impeccable. It's a special missions program ship. It's called an ocean surveillance ship. Its mission, basically, is to track submarines. That's what it does. Now, this is not all surveillance by one party. These are Chinese surveillance planes that have been seen over Japan's EEZ. Japan does not like it. It has been careful to not say it's illegal, but it considers it unfriendly, provocative, and even threatening. Malaysia and Vietnam have both protested military activities, exercises, foreign, in their EEZs. This is U.S. exercises, this is Chinese exercises, took place in the Japanese EEZ or claimed EEZ. All right, what's going on? How are these incidents related? Some may say they're not related at all. Well, I think they are. There's a nexus occurring here of political and technological development. First of all, you had extended jurisdiction, and in some politicians' minds, the very shape and extent of the nation has changed. It's no longer just a land-based resource base, but it's a maritime base as well, in some cases with offshore oil being the prime economic return to the country. There are overlapping claims. This makes it very sensitive, and the countries want to defend them. There has long been a coastal state desire to keep the maritime powers at some distance from them. There are also now new threats: smuggling, piracy, transport of weapons of mass destruction, and these new threats are of more concern to the maritime powers than they are to the coastal states. There's also been a rise in the size and the capabilities of navies, and what is triggering, I believe, these incidents is also technological advances, qualitative advances in signals intelligence. They've become more intensive, more intrusive. Cyber warfare has been occurring or testing from these platforms as well. And But on top of all this, there's a fundamental disagreement between the coastal states and the maritime powers as to what the regime is that governs military activities in the EEZ. Now, the U.S. basically says there are no rules. It's freedom of the high seas. There are no constraints. Its freedom is absolute. Some coastal states argue, China among them, that for a country that hasn't ratified the convention, and for situations that were not envisioned in the convention at the time, it is not for it to interpret the meaning of particular terms in that convention that surround these issues. Well, you don't have to read all of this. It's simply to say there are specific differences as in regard to the meaning of freedom of navigation. As I said, the U.S. says there are no constraints. Others say that, yes, they can be limited. For example, where maritime, where for example, one might be undertaking active sonar or live fire exercises that are damaging marine living resources. The states under the Convention on the Law of the Sea have the obligation to protect the environment. It's not just it's a duty. There are also other terms, such as other internationally lawful uses. Unfortunately, none of these terms were defined when the convention was put together. And there's terms like due regard. One is supposed to pay a due regard to the activities of each other. Non-abuse of rights, that is, you can't use a provision for a purpose for which it wasn't intended, and so on. And therefore, questions do arise as to whether military intelligence gathering and exercises are, in fact, in violation of some of these provisions. All right, let's cut to the chase. Is the U.S. legally correct in its assertion of freedom of navigation and overflight of the high seas to justify the operations of its military aircraft and vessels and others EEZs, in this case, China? Well, unfortunately, the answer depends on exactly what these planes and vessels were doing, and that is, unfortunately, classified. If it was simply passively gathering data, then I think one could say that this is a customary practice that has been going on for many years. However, there has been speculation that the EP-3 was tickling the defenses of China, that it was interfering with shore-to-submarine communications. In the case of the Impeccable, it's pretty obvious it was tracking the two new nuclear submarines that China has based at Hainan. Now, then one raises the question, is this a threat or use of force, as China puts it, preparing the battlefield? Well, the U.S. likes to interpret the threat of use of force as threatening the integrity of the state. Others, however, interpret it in a broader term. They say that with new technology and changes in technology, that some of the new devices may in fact be threatening and interpreted as such. So were the activities for peaceful purpose? Did they threaten the use of force? Were they an abuse of rights? How about the Bowditch undertaking hydrographic research? The U.S. says that hydrographic research, it does not require consent because it's not scientific research. That is the scientific regime that does require that consent. Well, again, it depends on the data that is being gathered. The reason for the consent regime was to prevent economic data from being gathered that could be used to the detriment of the state and to the benefit of someone else. Well, we do know, I can show you, where military data collected for those purposes initially has been used for economic advantage in various places around the world. Also, the U.S. conveniently is overlooking Article 258, which basically says if you put scientific research equipment in the water, you are doing marine scientific research regardless of the intent. Well, the point is, and then finally, can states legally prohibit or constrain foreign military exercises? Well, I mentioned the question of live fire exercises damaging biological resources. There might be some other situations. Now, the point of all this is to say that it is not a slam dunk, as one side or the other would have it. and each is holding to their interpretations, even expanding upon them. Now we have coming attractions. Unmanned subs, which can run indefinitely on ocean thermal energy. The littoral combat fleet, which is designed, in fact, to be intrusive. The drones, we've seen it questioned in the New York Times and elsewhere. Are these being used legally? And if they're being used for ocean surveillance or active interfering, shall we say, is that legal? All right, if nothing happens, then it'll be the practice of nations which will eventually determine customary international law. Since the United States is outside the treaty, it doesn't, as I say, have legitimacy to interpret the meaning of the various positions, and other countries are going right ahead and interpreting it in the way that they see it. If enough of them do it that way and set their national legislation in that way, then yes, it will become customary international law, whether the United States happens to like it or not. At the other end of the spectrum would be to sit down and talk about this, to try to develop some guidelines, voluntary though they may be, that would set the rules and to be able to determine what is friendly and what is an unfriendly act. China-U.S. bilateral agreement, yes, they're talking right by each other, they're not communicating, they're getting nowhere in their MCCA consultative agreement. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, if the U.S. ratified, China could take it to the court, or the U.S. could take it to the court. That's not going to happen, particularly on the hydrographic research side. The U.S. could lose, and it's not going to take that chance. So what you're left with is perhaps a regional approach where ASEAN and China together initiate some guidelines, something similar to the Declaration on Conduct of the South China Sea, or even the Bali Accord, which the U.S. finally came around to ratifying some years later. But that's what one's going to be left with, and until then the shark is still in the water, if you can see that.